This is Phoenix, and I would like to retrospect on my second published book, which is a collection of poetry. I identified the poems as being poetic stories rather than narrative poems, though for all intents and purposes, and for the sake of clarity, or for the sake of convenience, you could call them narrative poems. But they're a little bit more nuanced than narrative poems in the sense that what I had in mind with my poetic stories is this idea that um, they are stories in a poetic form rather than poems in a story form. And that's one of the biggest reasons for the distinction. Characters is a very nostalgic collection for me. It's a very nostalgic work for me because I wrote a lot of the poems when I was a teenager and growing up through college, essentially going through college, and so I worked on it for about eight years. I worked on the book for about 8 years, and suffice to say, I'm definitely very proud of it. I'm very proud of how it turned out. The collection is unique in my canon, and it's unique because of its kind of approach. And I would describe the collection as being very innocent. I would describe the poems as being innocent, the poems themselves. And I would describe many of the poems, if not all of the poems, as being very straightforward and very transparent. I'm not really working too much with form, at least extreme form, the way that I do in collections that I have published, such as Torque, or even Pocket Words, which is minimalist poems. I also have another collection called Wordless, where the poems are very fragmented and very stream of consciousness. And so this collection is very different from those poems because, like I said, it's very straightforward and it's focused on telling a story, but in poetic form. Cops and Robbers is by far one of my favorite poems that I've ever written, and it just so happens to be one of the first poems I ever wrote, if not the first poem I ever wrote, as well as the first poem of this collection. And Cops and Robbers has often been described as probably easily one of my most emotive poems. I remember reading it at a celebration, at a dinner celebration, and describing how I wrote that poem when I was a teenager and how one of the teenagers there, teenager himself, was there, and he was like, "You wrote that when you were a teenager?" And I was like, "Yeah," because I really did. No doubt I've progressed a long way since this 8-year project, Characters, in terms of writing. I've progressed and evolved in a lot of ways that I think are noticeable, even just with the cursory glance at my work. But I nonetheless see this work, I nonetheless see this work as a foundational text in my canon. And I see it as a foundational text because of its simplicity, because of its brevity, and yet also because of its emotional impact and appeal. There's definitely a ton of emotion in these poems. Oftentimes I'm dealing with heavy themes such as loss, pain and suffering, death, loneliness, with even some teenage angst, because of course I was a teenager when I wrote many of the poems. But yes, no doubt, many of the poems are very, very emotional, and they have an emotional appeal. Many of the poems are a name or are reminiscent of a name, such as Wade. And one thing that I like to do in this collection was have a pun on a name. So, for instance, I have a poem called Angel, and that's a play on the word angel as a name, as well as angel as the powerful being that exists in Christian lore. And again, to cite the example that I used before of Wade, Wade does the same thing. The story that I tell talks about, evokes the idea of wading in shallow waters, and basically being shallow-minded and cruel. But Wade is also a name. And I really enjoyed doing those puns in these collections because they really added a certain quality to the poems, a certain double meaning that I really appreciate. The poems also deal with mental illness, so I was just looking at my poem Mimsy, which is a play on the word mimsy by Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll's Portmanteau, and essentially Mimsy is about the development of schizophrenia, as well as other things. And this would make sense because I started writing this collection of poetry when I was dealing with a lot of stuff in my teenage years with mental illness, ranging from being in the hospital to dealing with symptoms to feeling alienated and unaccepted by my peers, and all of those things. If I was going to say anything about characters, wow, that would be tough. But if I was going to have to keep it simple, I would say that characters is simplistic for a reason. It's simplistic to represent the mindset of a child, the mindset of a teenager, and is by no means derogatory. But it's also simple in its presentation. It's unassuming. This is easily one of the most unassuming books that I've written, and that's because it wasn't influenced by academia at that point, simply by public schools. And I really appreciate that aspect that even though my later works are very focused on the process of writing, and this one is too, though to a different extent, that even though I care about the process of writing, I don't have the emphasis on kind of overly intellectualizing and being overly intellectual. And I really appreciate that simplistic, straightforward approach. And I feel like that's what makes it work, in all honesty, because the poems are relatively short, and yet they pack a punch because they're emotional and because they're really going back to the simple appeal of emotions that many people read poetry for. In fact, as a side note, Richard Cory, a poem by E.A. Robinson, Edwin Robinson, can't remember his exact name, but he wrote a poem called Richard Cory, and it was basically about a depressed man who ultimately commits suicide, and the poem was done in rhymes. And I used that as a model in many ways for my own poems, as I did with Out Out by Robert Frost, among other poems. By various writers, essentially writers that wanted to tell a story with an emotional punch. And so yeah, I guess to finish this talk, I would just say writing this book is super important to me, was super important to me, and having the book published is very important to me. And I feel like it makes a difference in the world because it's just so honest and brutally honest. It's so brutal and really just has a lot of integrity, and I seek to write like that, even with my over-intellectualizing and over-analysis in my more recent works. But I seek to continue that kind of integrity as a writer, and I believe that this work is exactly what keeps me honest as a writer, because it was basically my first book, with the exception of Away from Home, which I wrote when I was 19, which Away from Home is a novel. But that being said, I feel like this work radiates a lot of integrity and honesty. This is Phoenix, and I hope that you'll check this book out. I would be very, very happy if you bought a copy of this book, and supported indie writers. Yeah, thank you for your time. This is Phoenix, and thanks.